Well, thank you, Paul, for that kind introduction, and thank you, Emma, who conjured up this conference. I've just been walking around and found out what a wide swath of university interests are represented by the students at the back and faculty at the front. And Emma is not my wife, daughter, girlfriend, or anything. I had never met her. And how she comes to be able to spell my name, I don't know. But this meeting already shows that you people are conscious of your responsibilities as scholars and as scientists. I just want to, before I launch into the talk, which is supposed to be in part about what it's like to be a scientist, in part about the responsibilities of the scientist and how they impinge on the nuclear threat. But I just wanted to say, in case I forgot to say it, that I actually am a card-carrying scientist. I have a laboratory in the Department of Chemistry, and I have at this moment some students who are doing an experiment which goes day and night because they have to cool a large machine with liquid helium, and that costs about $1,500, so they don't heat it up afterwards. They keep it cold for 2 weeks. They work day and night, so they are as devoted as you people, particularly you people at the back here who have a heavy load of coursework and chose to come and spend one of your precious free days getting worried about where the world is drifting. So actually something happened last night, which was that my wife came home with a biography of Jonathan Swift, the author of Gulliver's Travels, and I wanted to start by reading a bit from it. He talks about scientists, and that's my first topic. And he really is reflecting on the naivety of people like myself, naivety which I'm about to show as I go on to wider subjects. And the naivety both distresses him and pleases him. And so here's what sort of thing he says. He mocks the scientists. So this is all 1700, in case Dean Swift isn't part of your history. And I'm going to quote from him. He talks about an early computer, 1700. It had a 20-foot square frame made of wood. Its surface was covered by words, which could be read off rotating wooden blocks by the most ignorant person, so they could write on philosophy, poetry, politics, or theology without the least assistance from mind or study. And so, you know, it's rare that you hear people mocking computers, but he got a good start in 1700. But having mocked scientists, and rightly so, I mean, you see the point, he then turned and admired them, and his way of doing it is charming. He invented some horses which spoke. They didn't speak a lot. In fact, scientists in general don't speak a lot, and so these were some sort of scientists, these horses. They're called huniums. And the interesting thing about the horses was, and again, think scientists, they had no word in horse language for lying because, and I quote Swift, because they could see no purpose in saying what is not. And also they had another handicap, or maybe it was an advantage, they had no word for war, these horses, because it had never occurred to them that you might want to kill people whom you'd never met. So I go on from these profound reflections of Jonathan Swift on scientists to say something about scientists. Let's see, I have to find my way back to what actually is my text. Here it is. Actually, I wanted to start by referring to Angela only she pronounces it Angela Merkel, who a few days ago was at the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin celebrating the 25th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, a great moment for freedom, and one would hope a great moment for peace. Anyway, what she said, and she's not a gushy sort of person, she said, dreams can come true. Nothing has to stay the way it is. And that's a message to us here today. It's a message that scientists resonate with. We value science for a whole lot of things. I mean, I suppose most people for its tangible benefits. Quite a lot of people rejoice in its power, though they fear its power. But the thing I wanted to recommend to you was that you recognize and acknowledge what a civilized activity science is. And first of all, it hunts for truth, and truth is something you can share with all of mankind. But also, it transcends barriers, and if you were to go into my laboratory or anybody else's, you'll find people from around the world. It tolerates dissent. That's a huge lesson. It has to tolerate dissent because everything that is accepted in science, just to pause, every orthodoxy of science. It's terrible if speakers have a frog in their throat because the only thing you remember from the talk is the frog. And so, yes, we learn to tolerate dissent. In fact, we have to invite dissent because without dissent, science is dead. And we have to admit that we make mistakes because as scientists, we're making mistakes all the time. And that's actually my job as the leader of a research group, is to show the members of my research group that I'm willing to take a chance and be proved wrong. I'm very good at that because I easily am wrong. Well, so all these marvelous things in science, of course, it's run by human beings who are egocentric, even though the goal is such a worthy one. They all want to be the first to uncover some secret of nature. Well, you know, I just end with these encomia by saying that you can see how much we value science, we who work in it, because the greatest reward we can get is not some foreign prize, but being allowed to continue to do science. That's what we all fight for. Of course, you have to get a research grant to do that. But it's an article of faith that's central. What do scientists do? Well, I don't have to tell you, you're too sophisticated. They don't collect facts. They really collect opinions, and the opinions slowly become more and more certain, like the facts about the so-called facts about climate change, and eventually they come classified as facts. But you don't get instruments, which of course are factual. Writing scientific papers, you have to get scientists to write the papers because scientists have opinions and scientists can tell stories, which in fact are the subject matter of science. Well, I could enlarge on that a bit. I mean, that at this point in people's talks about science, they always mention Albert Einstein, who claimed to be reading the mind of the Creator, which sounds as if he was conceited and arrogant, which he was probably conceited, but he wasn't arrogant. What's interesting is that the claim, reading the mind of the Creator, is an important one. He wasn't reading into the mind of the Creator. He was claiming that he was actually reading what the Creator had in mind. And you can quarrel with the wording. You can say there was no creator and Einstein's reading of it was imperfect. All that is true, if you like, but the thing that I'm stressing here is the commitment to the idea that truth actually exists. Really, objective truth exists. It's amazing. And the second notion, that it is accessible to the human mind. Well, so I've sung enough praise of science. I hope I've said a bit about its weaknesses. How does this enterprise, which I regard as a noble one, fare in Canada today? And I would say not terribly well, but that said, against the background, I did start by telling you the sort of thing, or did I? Maybe I didn't. The sort of thing that these people who are working around the clock in my laboratory are actually doing. What they're doing, I think I neglected to tell you, what they're doing is looking at molecules one at a time to see how they make their way across a crystalline surface, a beautiful crystalline surface, and they can see them. And what they're finding at this moment in the Lash-Miller building is that the molecules don't move just sort of ambling along like a drunk, which is the progress in diffusion, as the two physicists will tell you at length. But they actually, what they're finding is that under the right circumstances, the molecules actually leap in ballistic trajectories. They jump and land, and they are directed in their path. Okay, so why should you care? I don't know. But you see, what's going on here in this laboratory is that we are providing a new vocabulary for people who, so to speak, talk science. And the problem that we have in this country is that we want scientists to tell us just what sort of a sentence that new phrase or new word will be used in. In other words, we want the applications to be made apparent to the government of Canada prior to the discovery being made. And scientists want the money, and so they're willing to oblige, and we are all tremendously good at writing science fiction, and that's why I'm so attracted by Dean Swift. Well, but you know, this is damaging to the whole enterprise of science, that we have to lie so much about the motives. The motive is actually that, think of those four guys who are nursing that machine in the Lash-Miller building. They see the possibility of actually adding, maybe significantly, to understanding of something pretty fundamental. And that's all they see. And of course, they should be required to deliver, and on time, and at the least possible expense. But they shouldn't be required to tell you which Canadian industry will benefit. And they are required, and that's damaging. So I actually, just looking at my watch, but you know, I have time for one more quote from the biography of Swift. This time it's 1710, and he'd just been to the Royal Society in London, and it inspired him no end. And he wrote the following, again, I quote from Jonathan Swift. He's talking about a bunch of scientists, and he says solemnly, "It had been 8 years, a project for extracting sunbeams out of cucumbers. It was to be put, that's the sunbeams, were to be put in vials and sealed, to be let out in inclement summers. In 8 years more, he, that's the scientist, would be able to supply sunshine to the government's gardens at a reasonable rate." This is, every word is from Swift. But this scientist who's describing his project entreated Swift for a small cash advance because of the rising cost of cucumbers. Well, you know, one might try this proposal under the rubric of renewable energy today. I think I've drawn all the morals I want to draw, and I want to go on to the scientist as citizen, which is, after all, the main reason you bothered to come. Is humanity on a sustainable course? That's what worries us all. And if we have the sort of literacy called science, we have a responsibility to involve ourselves to some extent in what is the greatest of debates, since it has to do with our continued tenancy of the globe. The worst thing that could happen would be for humankind to divide into warring camps. And what was being celebrated a few days ago seemed to have been the end of one of the most frightening of divisions, the Berlin Wall, and could have marked the end of confrontation between the world's two greatest nuclear powers. But at the same time, Mikhail Gorbachev, who had a lot to do with the fall of the wall, warned of a new Cold War. And I think that fear is lurking in the backs of our minds and has something to do with the reason we're here. I think I'll just launch on a bit of biography, since somehow or other you found me and invited me to this meeting. Somehow or other we've survived for 70 years of the nuclear age, so we must be capable of learning. And during those 70 years, we've learned something about nuclear weapons. We've learned a lot in addition. We've learned a lot about understanding differences in nationality, as we never understood them before. We were so insular. Understanding differences in race, in color, sex, gender. By sex, I mean something different from gender. And in all these respects, I think our thinking has improved for the better in that 70-year time span. I said I did say something autobiographical, so at the age of 17, so that's younger than you people at the back, I drifted into Manchester University, and there was a news sheet, sort of newspaper, and nobody to edit it, so I got saddled with it, and it was a sheet which trumpeted the dawn of a new age, and I had been born just as a new age was being born, the nuclear age. And running that news sheet, aged 18, let's say, had consequences. Later, I joined this university, that was 1956 actually, and was approached by a group at Hart House who were planning to go and see the Prime Minister, Diefenbaker, to urge him, in effect, to renounce nuclear weapons on behalf of Canada. And there was a huge, we petitioned the faculty, we turned up in Ottawa with hundreds of signatures. It was such an unusual thing that it was twice on the front page of the Globe and Mail. It was, in many ways, a non-event, but anyway, it was unusual. And the country had a lengthy and crazy debate, and in the end made this act of self-denial. And of course, we may be mocked for it, but it was not an empty gesture. It helped define Canada as a country that's willing to take risks for peace, as in fact subsequent events showed we were. Now that's become a blurred image, but it can surely be recovered. Actually, I have to fill in a bit, because between Manchester and Toronto, I spent 2 years in Princeton, and when I was in Princeton, I found myself in contact with the people who had designed and built the first atomic bomb a decade before. I'm just trying to stress how short these histories are and how little time actually they give us to adjust our thinking. Anyhow, so then I came to Toronto, and because of this Princeton bit, I was invited from Canada to go to a disarmament meeting in Moscow in 1960. And the two topics that we broached are still on the agenda and should be. And the first one was steep arms reduction to a level of minimum for a sort of reminder that deterrence may have some meaning. Of course, abolition would be a preferable goal, but this is the step that one can envisage, and that was the step that we discussed in 1960. There were the first stirrings also of another debate, but let me just hammer home that. Why were we talking about reducing the number of nuclear weapons in 1960? Well, I have to go to some subsequent years, but maybe one needs, if one is young, particularly a reminder that McNamara, who I grew to know quite well through arms control discussions, advisor on defense to Kennedy, President Kennedy and President Johnson, said nuclear weapons are useless, totally useless, he said, except to deter an opponent from using theirs. Well, we try to use them for more than that, and it's questionable how stable that is. But anyway, that's what McNamara said, and it did impress us deeply. And another advisor to presidents who also turned up at arms control meetings that I was invited to through Pugwash, McGeorge Bundy, said something that we should never forget. In the real world of real political leaders, one hydrogen bomb on one city is a catastrophe, 10 a horror beyond history. Well, of course, that is the sort of impetus that has elicited speeches from President Obama about a world free of nuclear weapons, and at intervals, President Putin saying the same. But, the US and Russia, with 95% of the 17,000 nuclear weapons that exist, are making plans to modernize them at a cost of hundreds of billions of dollars. And again, that was hundreds of billions of dollars in preparation for the coming decades. I will return to that. But I just wanted to mention a second topic, which there were stirrings of discussion about it in the meeting in 1960, but it came to the fore in the subsequent years when there were conferences in various places, which I had the fortune to attend. And this second topic may strike some of you as an oddity. It is that together with reducing the level of nuclear weapons, we should abandon defenses against them. And that's a sort of fraught topic in Canada just now, because it happens that a recent report, a unanimous report of the Canadian Senate, recommended that Canada become a seamless partner of the United States in defense against intercontinental ballistic missiles. So what on earth is it that we then objected to, and I would still object to, in this particular quest for peace through defense? And incidentally, when we broached it with the Russians, they said, this is idiotic, you can't tell us to renounce defenses. And they changed their minds and became leading exponents of that viewpoint. There are two reasons for that. The first is that the defense is going to be leaky, and that leak comes under the heading McGeorge Bundy pointed to, a disaster beyond history. And the second reason, which seems in a way to contradict the first, is that though leaky, it is provocative. If you have a 50% effective defense, your opponent has one sure option, which is to double their number of weapons and render your defense irrelevant. So missile defense manages, and not everybody would agree, clearly, judging by the Canadian Senate a few months ago, it combines the worst of both worlds. It's ineffective and it's provocative. And if I were to say that and sit down, you'd say, well, very clever, but who's going to believe you? Well, the fact is that in 1972, which is getting on for half a century ago, the United States and the USSR signed an anti-ballistic missile treaty, which was a renunciation of anti-ballistic missiles. And that lasted for 30 years. It was a visionary thing, and was abrogated during the presidency of George W. Bush. And that was a major blow to sense and to arms control. But for 30 years, there was this renunciation of any major attempt to build defenses, and it was a step in the right direction, a step which recognized the new world of atomic weapons for what it is, which is a world after medieval defenses had fallen into inutility. Well, arms control is in a bad way. Geneva Conference on Disarmament is stalled. Russia may be cheating on the Intermediate Range Nuclear Force Treaty of 1987. Why? Well, perhaps I should ask why we embrace nuclear weapons. Obviously, there are commercial interests which are hugely important in that, hundreds of billions of dollars of them. But then there is prestige, which is also hugely important. The original nuclear powers, 5 of them, US, Russia, UK, France, and China, sit by right, because they have nuclear weapons and were the original possessors, on the highest body in the world, the UN Security Council. And what is even worse is that all 9, and I'm smuggling in a bit of useful information here, there are 9 nuclear powers. All 9 nuclear powers increasingly, perhaps the word increasingly doesn't apply to all of them, but all base their security doctrine, as it's called, on the possession of these weapons. So that's what we have to oppose. Why is it so hard to oppose? Why this reluctance to disarm? Well, and let me remind you, Churchill made the remark that peace may be the sturdy child of terror. He meant maybe these weapons are going to usher in peace. But just go and read about the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. There would have been no such crisis without nuclear weapons. And it ended with, on the absolute brink of the most awful disaster history has known. No one dreamt, least of all McNamara, who I kept meeting at arms control meetings, no one dreamt of repeating that. And yet, we may be on our way to doing so. And why is this so dangerous? Because deterrence, after all, only works if the deterred party believes that it is real. And the only way to make it seem real is to make it real. So deterrence works only if it may fail to work. And those of you who are students of philosophy and physics and so on will recognize what an appalling contradiction that is. Nobody wants to play nuclear roulette into the future. I'll just close, I think, by saying that the reason we pay attention to science is because we hope that this is an enclave where reason holds sway, and that was Angela Merkel's thought in proclaiming a few days ago, we can change things, and we can. But to do so, we have to learn from science, in part, what a miracle is our continued existence on this planet. There could be no better use, really, for science than to teach us that lesson. Thank you all for your attention.